Our inner city Christian meetings of the Shalom group, led by Chris and Lillian Rowe, lived an entirely countercultural life. They had few possessions and no desire for them. And having nothing, like the earliest Christian communities, they had everything in common. It was entirely anachronistic and also kind of beautiful. To Larry, Edge, and me, this way of life carried a ring of truth. It looked to our young minds like the real thing, not that we would know what the fake thing was. As Chris took us through his Bible and talked about how God had become human in a first-century Palestinian Jew, the words seemed to come alive. We were the students, he was the teacher. But it would have been good if, just now and again, Chris had asked us a question or two about the world beyond his community that we were also a part of. As we sat around their kitchen table in 1981, in the wake of Boy's success, Lillian watched how Chris's answers were met by our open-faced questioning, and I sensed she understood and was sympathetic to the contrast. She could see Chris's great strengths as a spiritual guide, but also his humanity. He was born of another time, the literality of his reading of the scriptures always winning out over the poetic. In that sense, he was a fundamentalist, with all those certainties and clear interpretations. Chris worried that our generation would not hear about the radical gospel of Jesus, that they would confuse Christianity with churchiness. How could we help with such a problem? We tried to explain, no doubt in a clumsy, naive way, that maybe our generation needed verbs, not nouns, needed to be loved, not lectured. That bumper sticker Christianity was driving people away from their churches. It was clear that Chris saw our potential as missionaries being taken over by the mission of our music. I thought I noticed Lillian smile to herself when I tried to convince her preacher man that our group could serve God better if we served the gifts we'd been given, that surely heaven would be happy if our band was a success and we'd have the means to help others a little more here on earth. But the preacher man couldn't see it. He was a good shepherd, and we were his lost sheep. But actually, this sheep was starting to think that sometimes even shepherds lose their bearings. When Edge asked her about a story doing the rounds, that this charismatic couple were perhaps a little too fervent in their evangelizing, she responded that she chose not to worry about her reputation. The human heart is wayward by nature, she said, wiping down the kitchen counter. So remember that every time you point your finger, there's 3 pointing back at you. She smiled generously. Sometimes a smile or a laugh is more trustworthy than any amount of seriousness. At first, Shalom had accepted how we looked and dressed. Gavin had styled his haircut on a David Lynch movie, Eraserhead, and he could look pretty intimidating. Some days he wore a skirt with bother boots and jewelry, big exaggerated rings. At first, they'd been tolerant of the music we listened to, but it was becoming clear that this had been to lure us in. Over months, the questions from Shalom began to wear us down. Was our music ephemeral, transient? Wasn't the real calling to preach the gospel? How real was our faith? How ready were we to be pilgrims? Chris seemed to know the answers already. There's no greater insult to a young man than to question his fervor. How tough is he? How serious and committed? Even if you're a slacker, you're a committed slacker. Mostly a young man wants to be challenged to do difficult, if not impossible things, like to give up his music. Eventually it became too much for Edge. He couldn't live with the apparent contradiction of being in a band, finding a global audience, and this humbler calling to serve a local community. He was asking himself questions about the utility of art. The Presbyterian was starting to win out over the Zen. I drove over to his parents' house in Malahide one evening and sat down on his bed. I had a feeling he wasn't interested in talking about how the second album, October, was coming on. But I didn't know quite what was on his mind. I didn't know that when I arrived, I was in a band, and when I left, I wouldn't be. I've got a problem I can't solve in you two, he explained. I'm not sure I want to make music this way. Edge is not a complainer and doesn't do melodrama, but he was in some kind of agony. Chris, Dennis, all of them, they're asking questions that I just can't answer. What sort of questions, I asked, as if I didn't know. About whether we can be a band and be believers. Those questions. Look, I'm troubled too, but there's a special feeling when we play. It's when we stop playing, I feel like. But I won't say I'm not challenged by these people. I don't have answers to their questions either. But Edge did have an answer, a radical one. There's so many problems, messy, complicated problems out there in the world, and maybe running away with the circus is not what we've been called to, or not what I'm called to. I've spoken to Aisling. She understands. I hope you do. I'm out, Bono. I really am. I'm so sorry. It was a shock to hear it put so boldly, but logically I knew what followed. Well, if you're out, I'm out. I've no interest in being in this if you're not there. Who'll tune the guitars? We better speak to Larry and Adam. We better speak to Paul. That's going to be very awkward. Heading back to Cedarwood Road in the tiny Fiat 127 I'd just learned to drive, I felt a sense of peace. Though maybe that's the wrong word. There's a kind of calm that can come over you when you make a big decision, a decision that is nobler than the one you really want to make. There might be a smidgen of the martyr about it. It didn't so much feel like I was leaving you two, but more like I was joining the army and might be heading off to some unknown location with the chance of never being seen again. You tell yourself everything is okay because you're doing the honorable thing and that such sacrifice is a measure of the seriousness of your commitment. Maybe today we'd use the word indoctrinated. Perhaps that was the case, although none of us knew it. What else could explain why, after all this time and commitment and the first signs of success? It was a question I couldn't articulate, which probably explains this other feeling that sat with me as I drove. A huge sadness and a loneliness. I got back to Cedarwood Road and sat or slumped on the stairs to call Ali on the phone. She understood in the way you understand your friends who have made up their minds to do something courageous and difficult. I spoke to Larry, who also understood. He had his own questions. Only Adam didn't get it. Why would he? Adam wasn't part of any fire-breathing prayer meetings like Shalom. But it's the measure of the man that he opted for solidarity with us when we met with Paul to say that there wasn't going to be a next tour. Was it a battle between two stewards, two managers, two impresarios who both had a mission for us and were offering guidance on how we might make our way? Chris Rowe was a man of God convinced the world would be a better place that heard the radical message of Jesus. Paul McGuinness was a man of the world who thought rock and roll allowed people to be more themselves. For one, we'd be missionaries. For the other, we'd be musicians. We went to see Paul, who heard us out. There was a pause. The room quieted. And then Paul spoke. Am I to gather from this that you have been talking with God? He asked. We think it's God's will, we earnestly replied. So you can just call God up? Yes, we intoned. Well, maybe next time you might ask God if it's okay for your representative on earth to break a legal contract. I beg your pardon? Do you think God would have you break a legal contract? A contract that I have signed on your behalf, a legal contract for you to go on tour. How could it be possible for this God of yours to want you to break the law and not fulfill your responsibilities to do this tour? What sort of a God is this? Good point. God is unlikely to have us break the law. Edge agrees and argues he was always looking for some kind of signifier to go on. Rethink. Paul, to himself, checkmate.